Morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me for our Monday morning day text. We'll be wrapping up the letter of 2 John this morning. Really not a very long letter. So if you read our last or watched our last day text and read it together with today, you'll essentially have the 2 day text videos comprising a review of 2 John. And that's because it's just not very long. And some of the verses in it are just more correspondence related, wishing people well, referencing individuals, which we will read, but it's just not a lot of material to expound upon. So the day text readings for 2 John and 3 John will go pretty quickly. We should be done with 3 John by Wednesday, and then we'll start the Revelation. Good morning to everyone. Okay, and thank you all again for joining me yesterday on the CW Jatak show. That was a good show. Gave us another opportunity to present information that I think will be useful to many people and help them to accept Jesus as the Christ and to help others to understand why we accept him so that they can consider the reasons on their own. Okay, well, let's get right to the text then, and we'll see what it has to say. It definitely has some things that we'll be able to talk about. So 2 John, I'm going to read verses 9 through 13, and I may stop or read straight through, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, 2 John, starting in verse 9. Every person who advances, but who does not live with the teaching of the Christ is not close to God. Okay, so we can advance and yet not get close to God. The one who lives with the teaching of Jesus, coming as a man, is close to both the Father and the Son. Verse 10, if anyone comes toward you and does not put up with or support the teaching about Jesus coming as a man, you must not start bringing that person into a house gathering, and you must not speak with the person in order to rejoice. Verse 11, because the one speaking with that person in order to rejoice contributes to or shares in the evil person's practices. And then this is where he concludes the letter of 2 John, verses 12 and 13. I have many things to write to you, though I do not plan on doing so through papyrus and ink. Instead, I hope to come to you and to speak mouth to mouth, so our joy may be full. Verse 13, the children of your sister, the chosen one, give you their regards. And we can certainly appreciate in verse 12 how they didn't have many occasions to see each other and had to, when they weren't together, write and send messages. But here you can tell he really desires to see them, verse 12, face to face, mouth to mouth, and talk. And similarly today, although we can see each other like now online, we're not really together in person. There's really nothing like being together in person, right? So we never want to lose sight of that. Always try to meet your brothers and sisters in person if you can, so that you can pray together, partake of the bread and wine moderately, so that you can share in the expectation and the proclamation of the coming of Jesus. Now let's go back to these earlier verses. Every person who advances but does not live with, that's how close it's supposed to be with you, lives with you. Live with the teaching of the Christ is not close to God. The one who lives, now there's 2 teachings you could really see in the letters of John. One, remember he talks about the teaching which they've had from the beginning, which is to love each other. And he also points out that there are many who are denying Jesus as coming in the flesh and not accepting him as the Son of God. So that's why he emphasizes here the one who lives with the teaching of Jesus, verse 9, coming as a man, is close to both the Father and the Son. So we know John obviously taught that here, and in his gospel or great message account, John 1, speaks of the Word in the beginning with God, who existed as a God, just like the other sons of God, whom Jesus himself said are gods, by quoting Psalm 82. Not the gods, although some of those gods may have been rebellious against Jah, they were nonetheless called gods. That's Jesus' point, that if he's not rebelling against Jah and he's a son of God, yet these rebellious sons of God can be called gods, why can't he? And we believe he can. And we believe he is. And it's consistent with everything that we read about in the biblical text concerning the one God as the Father, because Jesus only does the will of the Father. He doesn't do his own will. That's why he and other sons of God can at times speak as if they're Jah, because they are Jah at that time, representing him in every capacity. And so they are given that authority. Jesus is given it even more so because he went beyond what any of the other angels did and came to live as a man, like John is telling us here, gave his life and was resurrected. None of the other sons of God did that. That's what Hebrews 1 is all about. Which of these sons of God did he say this? He said it to this one, this Son of God, Jesus. So John talked about it in John 1:1, the Word existing in the beginning, how he became flesh, verse 14, and dwelt among us. Right? That's the teaching of Jesus coming as a man. He goes on to describe how no one has seen God except the only begotten God, who is close to the Father. He's the one explaining him to us. He's the one who, when you look at, according to what he said in John 14, if you've seen and heard him, you're seeing and hearing the Father. Okay, so there's no difference. He essentially is the Father, is Jah to us. He's not being himself. He tells us that. I'm not doing my own will. What I teach is not mine. Those are Jesus' words. So when we see him, we're seeing the Father. Those are also Jesus' words, John 14. But it's hard for some, and I understand it can be a little difficult, but that's why you're not supposed to delve into the metaphysical things you don't know about. Just accept the text, right? If Jesus uses Psalm 82, gods, plural, for other sons of God against whom God's word came, to defend himself as the Son of God, being called a God, and yet there's no compromise to monotheism, well, then that's what you should teach, right? You don't need to then go several hundred years later, beyond the time when the Son of God came, who, according to 1 John 5:20, gave us the capacity so that we can understand the Son and the true God. Well, why do we need to look several hundred years after 1 John 5:20 to gain a sense of the metaphysical relationships that aren't communicated to us in these texts? What's told to us in these texts is that there's one God, the Father, and that Jesus came as a man, though he was a God with the Father, not as a rival, but as a Son of God, as one of the sons of God, the Son of God, who defends his Father's true Godship beyond more than anyone. And by the way he does it is not just by quoting texts and applying them. He lives exactly what the Father tells him and teaches him. And so he came as a man. And that's why the Father sent him. 1 John 14, 15. The Father sent forth his Son as the Savior of the world. It's the Father who's doing all these things. It's the Father who is working through the Son. He's not even doing those things on his own. He says it multiple times. And explicitly in John 14, he says, it's the Father working through me. That's what we need to recognize. Now, also Paul. So we know John taught Jesus coming as a man, both here and in John's gospel, as I quoted and referenced. And Paul did as well, right? Paul in Philippians 2 said, though he was existing in the form of a God, he didn't consider that equality as something to hold on to, that spirit being equality. He gave it up. He gave it up to live as a man so that he could show us his Father and we might have faith in the Father through him. So Paul talks about Jesus living as a God, just like John 1:1. It's the exact same thing, basically. Slightly different wording. Although he was existing in the form of a God, in the beginning, the Word was a God. Same thing with God, and he became flesh, or he became a man. Philippians 2 and John 1 tell the same story, in just slightly different terms. And Paul goes on to write that when he realized he was a man, that he then continued to do God's will all the way to death. And for that reason, the Father exalted him above everyone, so that in his name, the Son's name, the name his Father gave him, everyone should bow to the glory of God the Father. If you bow to Jesus and you're not doing so to the glory of God the Father, then you are failing the teaching of the Christ. You are not following the teaching of John, of Paul, or the Son, because they all made it very clear to us that Jesus is here to glorify the Father, and the Father will in turn glorify the Son and us if we continue and follow the Son all the way into the coming age. So now let's take a little bit closer look at verse 10. If anyone comes toward you and does not put up with the teaching about Jesus coming as a man, you must not start bringing that person into a house gathering, and you must not speak with the person in order to rejoice. Okay, many of us know that the Watchtower and maybe other groups will use this text at times to, shun people, basically. And by shunning, of course, I realize that both Watchtower people and Trinitarians who may shun us in the sense of not working with us in Christian ministry, and they will. But it doesn't mean they'll ignore us in every aspect of life, just like Watchtower witnesses don't really ignore us in every aspect. They may ignore us in more. But my point is that the Trinitarians and the Watchtower people are using things other than this text and the teaching of it, that Jesus came as a man, to cause division. Okay? They are dividing Christianity over acceptance of the Watchtower or acceptance of the Trinity, when according to 1 John 5:20, we have the intellectual capacity because the Son of God came, and we understand the true one and his Son. We don't need the Trinity, but they use it anyway, so much so that they won't work with us as Christians. They won't even accept us as Christians. Now the question is, okay, so will we do the same? Well, you already know that I would accept anyone who basically accepts Jesus as the Christ, the Son of God, and who doesn't contradict the clear biblical teaching of his preexistence or separation from the Father in terms of an individual being. You already know that I would accept a person like that as someone who we can work with and try to proclaim the Christ and the reasons for accepting him. But so, and in that same video, Who Are the Christians, I explained, I believe, maybe in one of the questions, that I wouldn't work with someone in a Christian ministry who denied that Jesus pre-existed his human existence, his human birth. But you see, so then the question is, well, okay, well, Greg, or you or others, you won't work with us as Christians because we don't accept the pre-existence of Jesus, for those who don't. So am I shunning them in a sense in that respect? Yes. Yes, I am. I'm doing that specifically for this text and others because I'm using the teaching of the Bible. The pre-existence of Jesus is a biblical teaching. It's all over the place. I don't care what Buzzard or any of these other people say. Their arguments are lame, and I've refuted most, if not all of them already, in my writings and just in general discussion. So I'm not going to work with someone in a Christian ministry who openly denies the obvious teaching of the Bible. But that does not include the Watchtowers, the governing body. Okay? That's not an obvious teaching of the Bible. That does not include the Trinity. That is not an obvious teaching of the Bible. it does include the pre-existence of the Christ, which is an obvious teaching of the Bible. And it includes him coming as a man from his existence with the Father. Coming as a man. Jesus came as a man. The plan of God didn't come as a man. Jesus came as a man. And they're referring to him in the personal sense in which he existed before he actually became Jesus, but was still the same person. That's why it refers to him that way. And the Word became flesh, dwelt among us. It talks about him being with the Father in a special position, revealing things. He's clearly a personal being. He's referred to over and over again as the firstborn of God, the beginning of God's creation. He came from the Father. He heard from the Father. All the things that would just, in such a basic reading of the text, tell us he existed before he came to the earth. He even says that, I'm from the realms above, you're from the realms below. Now, you can interpret that in any other way you want. That's not what we're going to do. We're just going to take his words and accept them. We don't need to interpret them. What do you need to interpret all these things for? Do you not understand the words? I was talking with someone in comments the other day about, John 10. And they're trying to basically summarize my view of what Jesus said. And I'm like, look, are you going to just read the words of the text? Why don't you just read the words of the text and follow them? Stop talking about them. Stop trying to reinterpret them or make sense of them. It's just what it says. There's no added explanation you need to come up with to figure this out. Just read the text, right? Let's read it again in this case. If anyone comes toward you and doesn't put up with the teaching about Jesus coming as a man, you must not start bringing that person into a house gathering. Okay, so as Christians, we're told right here that if people do not accept Jesus coming as a man, we're not to start bringing them into our house gatherings, whether they're Christian or not. Because it says right there at the last part of the verse, verse 10, you must not speak with the person in order to rejoice. Right? Because they deny our most sacred belief, fundamentally, relative to our salvation. Jesus coming as a man in fulfillment of God's purpose and promise in Eden. So it's not but we don't shun the person completely in terms of, if they need help, we'll help them. Or if we work with them, we work with them. Or if we just see people socially in ways that require involvement. It's not like we get paranoid over every little exposure we have to someone who doesn't agree with us on Jesus coming as a man. And, but, we need to be careful who we bring into our homes. And we need to be cautious about whom we rejoice with, or with whom we rejoice. Because if we start rejoicing frequently with people who don't believe our most sacred and obviously taught beliefs, Jesus coming as a man, well, then how much do we really believe them? How much do we really care about them in terms of whether or not people even will put up with them, right? It says doesn't even put up with. They don't have to be committed believers necessarily, but if they're not even going to put up with us in our belief about Jesus, well, then we're really going to be in a situation where they might compromise us, because if they won't put up with us, they'll probably look for opportunities to keep us from believing these things. And so if we're not careful, we could find ourselves in the company of people who really just don't support what we do. And while that's not uncommon or unexpected, how many of those people do you want to have close to you? True, we may not have a lot of Christians we can associate with right now, but do you think John always did? He says right here at the end of the verse, he's looking forward to speaking with them mouth to mouth. So obviously he's been in isolation of some kind for a while, or at least from these people. So we don't always have the benefit of being in person with each other, though it is a benefit, as John even here points out. But what we should try to do fundamentally and start off with in our Christian association with others is whether or not people will put up with the teaching that Jesus came as a man. And that teaching in the Bible is him being in the beginning with God, as a God, who then came and took flesh. That teaching is Jesus existing in the form of a God and giving up that equality with God as a spirit being to become equal with men, although greater in the sense that he was sinless, but still like a man in that he was subject to the things that we're subject to in this world apart from sin. Although he was around all kinds of sin and in a sinful world, so much more difficult than Adam, I would say. So, in either case, our goal is to try to live with this teaching. So try to be cautious about those whom you bring close to you. If they support the idea, maybe they don't believe it 100%, but they're not going to contradict you. They get it. They understand the text. They see what you're saying, and they're not going to make it difficult for you to believe that Jesus came as a man like the Bible teaches. Then that's probably someone you can associate with in a way that won't compromise your joy. You can associate with whoever you want, but not every person is going to give you the same benefit. And many of them are going to give you a negative consequence. So if we're not cautious, we could lose out on our reward. And so, yeah, I like that. So Justin Julius, people will say, well, this is what Jesus really meant. Anytime you find somebody trying to reinterpret the words of the text, right there, you know there's something wrong. Unless it's a really, really special circumstance that, requires some kind of additional explanation, maybe, and looking for other uses of words that aren't just as commonly used as in the text. Sometimes there's an occasion where we got to look at it a little bit more. That's not the regular process of biblical interpretation. You just read the text. Okay? It is reliable. It's understandable. Not everyone believes it, though. So that's the problem. But we do not shun people entirely just because they do not agree with us. We simply are cautious in terms of who we bring into our homes, or obviously whom we work with in the public to promote the Christ, because if we end up contradicting each other, we're not going to promote the Christ the way we should be. But we'll work with anybody who will agree to set aside our differences to promote Jesus as the Christ. But if you don't accept him as coming in the flesh from existing with God, then we're going to be limited in terms of what we can do with you spiritually. And we'll just have to do the best we can. But we're here to promote the teaching of the text, not to get off of it onto some other ideas. So let me just take a quick look at some of the comments in case I'm overlooking anything of importance. I know all your comments are important, but I try to be selective in terms of what I can add to the discussions we have each day. And so, okay. Yeah, I think all the comments are pretty much in line with what we're talking about. Good information there. So, as brief as the letter of 2 John was, can you see how important it really is? Even the prior day text that we had great information for us to keep in mind. So does this one. It reminds us of the important things they were holding on to. Jesus coming as a man. That's what John starts off his gospel explaining. This pre-existence, coming as a man, and then the things he did as a man before he returned to the Father. Like Jack's comments there. Okay, that's very good. So then I think, let's see, is there any other points here? A lot of good information as we discussed about already. I don't want to repeat points if we've already covered them sufficiently. I'll just highlight again verse 11, that be careful with whom you rejoice. We can't always plan out the occasions where we might find ourselves rejoicing. Sometimes we're at work and there's a party or corporate function. We want to be joyful, right? We don't want to be the one person who just doesn't express joy because we don't think other people there are accepting the teaching of the Christ. It specifically refers to bringing them in your home, okay, and rejoicing with respect to those kinds of things. But, we obviously would want to be cautious in terms of how we rejoice outside of our homes or at any function, so that we're not promoting something that's clearly, potentially, I should say, harmful to other people. But otherwise, we do want to be filled with joy. We don't want people thinking of us as joyless, that's for sure. But at the same time, we don't want to confuse them and make them think that just any old teaching about Jesus is going to be tolerated, especially if we decide we want to get closer to that person. Because then, if we tolerate their intolerance of our teaching, before you know it, we're not going to be very tolerant of that person or of our teaching, one or the other. So, be cautious of those who you associate with and try to be a good influence on those whom you're around. And promote the teaching of the Christ where you can, either by expressly referring to these texts or just by living the best way you can in imitation of Jesus. Okay, I think that covers the day text enough. We're going to start 3 John tomorrow, and I should be around pretty much all week. I'm going to be doing some other videos. I finally got the Toy Story 4 plus 1, 2, and 3 up, so that's good. That frees me up to consider maybe some other Hollywood garbage dumps, but I'm going to do some other videos first from what I've already done, just get some separate clips on some good information that I think will benefit you. And then this Sunday, I'm going to do Open Session 7. And I'm going to start the show about a few things. One of the topics will be pharmakia, an understanding of the Greek term pharmakia and its association with things like drugs today. So we'll talk about that because that's a subject that people have brought up. And hopefully it will bring some clarity to the meaning of that term and its application to various things today, so that we can better discuss it with others and make good choices in our life. So I hope you all have a wonderful day. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And may God bless you. In Jesus' name.